All right, great. Thank you, everyone. So, we're really going to kick off the second half of the day with a special presentation. We're very honored and lucky to welcome to our summit today the Honorable Jed Kolko. Jed is the Undersecretary of Commerce for Economic Affairs at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And in his role as Undersecretary, Jed coordinates all economic analysis for the Commerce Department, and he provides both direction and oversight for the Census Bureau, for the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and for the Chief Economist in the Office of the Undersecretary. Before coming to Commerce, Jed was the Chief Economist at Indeed. And Indeed, you will all likely have heard or seen one of their commercials on television, and it is the global leader for global job search and matching. And Jed, in his distinguished career arc, has also served on the board of the National Association for Business Economics, NABE, and the California Budget and Policy Center. Yes, I should mention, I think, Jed, you're kind of coming home. You're not from Davis, but you spent a lot of time here in California. Jed, I want to thank you for being with us and for sharing your thoughts with our community on a new era for place-based investment.
So thank you, Chad, Deborah, and the council for inviting me to speak. I also want to thank Chancellor May and UC Davis for hosting us. Thanks for the kind introduction. The one thing I will add is just a bit about the California piece. Prior to moving to DC about a year ago, for my role at the Commerce Department, I lived 20 years in San Francisco, often came to Sacramento during the years that I was at the Public Policy Institute of California, with frequent stops to buy food in Davis, which between the meat lab and the farmer's market is probably the best place to live if one is a serious home cook, has always been my sense. So it's great to be back here. Lots of nostalgic feelings being back in Northern California after this first year in DC. As Chad mentioned, I'm the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs at the Commerce Department. Bunch of things that means. One, I help oversee all the data standards and data governance at the Commerce Department. And, there are a lot of things we do with data at Commerce. So that's a lot of fun. Lead economic advisor for the secretary, work with the White House. Lots of sort of urgent phone calls about what just happened in the economy and what does it mean. So that's the second piece. And then the third piece is really working closely with the federal statistical system, overseeing the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the people who bring you GDP and the Fed Preferred's inflation index, and lots of incredibly useful regional data, including probably the best cost of living data we have across the US. All of these different parts of what we do at the Commerce Department come together in this question of place-based investments. And what I'd like to do today for the next few minutes is hit on three things. First, describe some of the trends, many of which are challenging trends in the US around geographic inequality and regional competitiveness. Second, would like to share with you what the Biden-Harris administration is doing in terms of place-based investments. There's really been a new and distinct focus on place-based policies in this administration. And I will explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, and why things are happening now around place-based investments that weren't happening 5, 10, 20 or more years ago. And then finally, I'm going to say a few words about how we're using research and data to improve the effectiveness of these programs, bringing together what we can do at Commerce, given that within Commerce are these two incredibly important and rich statistical agencies with all the programs that we oversee as part of the Commerce Department. So first of all, I'd like to spend a few minutes setting the stage for why there has been this renewed emphasis on place-based investments. Our own research shows that geographic inequality is widening in the US. So unlike other forms of inequality, which we know from excellent research that others have done, that some forms of inequality have actually started to narrow slightly in the past few years, partly because of strong wage gains at the lower end of the distribution, both before and during the pandemic. Many forms of inequality peaked in the last decade and are starting to narrow a bit. But that's not true for geographic inequality. When we look at the gap, the spread between high-income places in the US and low-income places in the US, that spread continues to widen, as it has pretty steadily for at least the last 40 years. Since 1980, we've seen an increasing spread, and it is at least as much about the top places pulling away as it is about the bottom places falling farther behind. But it's a widening of the whole distribution of income when we think geographically. There's also been surprisingly little change in how places rank in terms of their income or education. So it's one thing if you've got significant inequality, but still a lot of mobility of places sort of jumping up and down the rankings over time. But there is both widening inequality and relatively little movement in which places are high and low income in the US, which places are high and low education in the US. For the most part, the ranking by educational attainment, percent bachelor's degree, looks almost the same in 2020 as it did in 1980. The correlation between the two is something like 0.9. So it means that there is a fairly stagnant almost distribution or ranking of places in the US in terms of education and income. Now, there have been a handful of exceptions of places that really moved up the ranking over these years, almost always because of a particular industry or even a particular company that took root and created a sustainable agglomeration that really drove income growth or mobility and workforce development that rose educational attainment. Charlotte, North Carolina is one, Pittsburgh, a second, Northwest Arkansas, where Walmart, Tyson Foods, and others are headquartered, is a third, and Provo, Orem, Utah is a fourth place that really have seen significant climbs up the scale in education or income or both. But they are the exceptions to a fairly stable ranking of how places do. At the same time, there's been a striking trend in declining geographic mobility. People are much less likely to move today than they were 20, 40, 50 years ago. There was a rule of thumb, when I first started paying attention to real estate, that like people moved every 7 years. Well, it's now something like every 11 years that the average person moves. And that's been a change, over only the past couple of decades. And it used to be that the average American moved every 5 years. So this decline in mobility has lots of potential reasons. This is one of these big, super important questions that economists spend lots of time fighting about, and there are lots of theories, none of which is definitive. But some of the possible reasons include high housing costs that prevent people from moving to places with lots of economic opportunity, other kinds of barriers to mobility like occupational licensing, which makes it hard for people in some careers to continue to practice their work if they move to a different state. Whatever the reason, there has been strikingly less geographic mobility than there used to be. All of this makes the increase in geographic inequality even more important because it's less a question of just people moving to where incomes are higher and opportunities are richer. I think another challenge for thinking about economic development policy and place-based investment is that the local economic challenges are so varied across the US. So as part of my role, I've traveled across the country, different places talking with local leaders, economic development officials, to try to get a sense of what is holding things back in a place. Thinking both about opportunities, but also about challenges. And a lot of things have surprised me, in fact. For instance, that in Rapid City, South Dakota, the concern that almost everybody mentioned first was housing affordability. And I thought, I just lived 20 years in San Francisco, so I'm used to people talking about like housing affordability and housing shortages. But I didn't expect people to talk about that with as much concern and passion in Rapid City, South Dakota. Then places that may even be nearby to each other often have very different approaches to how they think about local economic development and how they think about overcoming different challenges like workforce shortages. So in Northwest Arkansas, when I was there, I heard a lot about strategies to attract people to the region so companies could have the talent they need. But 2 hours away in Tulsa, the conversation was much more about how to provide opportunities for residents, where Tulsa was still is very much in the shadow of the 1921 Black Wall Street Massacre and is very focused on how to ensure that economic development opportunities go back to the existing community as opposed to thinking about attracting migrants in. Nearby in the Inland Empire, I heard all about both the benefits and challenges of rapid growth that depends on the warehousing and logistics industries. That's created lots and lots of jobs, incredibly fast population growth, but also with some costs. In the Pine Ridge tribal lands in South Dakota, the lack of basic infrastructure, whether it's internet service, cellular service, the absence of retail, and of course, very few jobs, made it sort of hard to think about anything else in any of the other places that I visited. And then the Salt Lake City area, which I had in mind was, at least in part, a story of tech-driven economic development. Everyone was very insistent that it was not just about tech, and they were extremely aware, rightly so, about the importance of maintaining a very diverse industrial base and thinking very long-term, understanding industries rise and fall in their fortunes, as do individual firms. And it made me think a lot about my hometown of Rochester, New York, an incredibly successful place for many decades, but of course, fortunes very closely tied to Kodak. And now, as Kodak looks very different today than it did, so does Rochester, New York. And so thinking about the incredible diversity of places and challenges in this country, it's not just geographic inequality that places are similar and some are just sort of doing better than others. It is really, a richness of opportunities, but also such a broad set of challenges that clearly no one policy fits all when we think about place-based investments and economic development. So given all this context, widening geographic inequality, declining geographic mobility, and this incredibly rich and challenging diversity of different local challenges and opportunities, what's the administration doing? So this administration is very focused on place-based policies. And I define these in this way. Place-based policies either direct investments intentionally to particular places, or they're intentionally designed to close geographic gaps. Some policies do both, but it's either intentional investment to particular places or closing geographic gaps. Now, within that definition, there's a whole set of things that could count as place-based policies. And some have different motivations, designed very differently. There are at least dozens of different kinds of policies that the administration is working on right now that fit this broad definition. One way to sort of make sense of all these policies and categorize them into some meaningful buckets comes from answering, when faced with any given place-based policy, trying to answer two questions about it. The first is it more about trying to combat geographic inequality by targeting distressed places, or is it more focused on boosting competitiveness by targeting higher capacity places? So programs that are more focused on geographic inequality, would naturally try to target the places in greatest need and most distress. But if the goal is boosting competitiveness, then you might target not those in most distress, but those with the highest capacity. What does capacity mean? Of course, totally depends on the program, but capacity probably is some mix of the existing endowment of workforce, infrastructure, accessibility, the sort of civic institutional framework, and so on. Of course, few programs are only about distress or only about capacity, but there's a pretty wide range of how these programs fall. The other dimension, in addition to narrowing geographic inequality versus boosting local competitiveness, is whether a program is specific to a given industry or industry agnostic. And there are place-based policies that fit into both of those categories. So to give some examples, right now, Commerce is working on more than $100 billion of investments in specific places through place-based policies. For instance, EDA's Recompete pilot program, $200 million designed to revitalize regions with unusually low employment rates. And this is a program that's really focused on places that are more distressed and is industry agnostic. In the same category is the broadband money, NTIA's Internet for All programs that are offering tens of billions of dollars to bring broadband to unserved and underserved communities. Again, the focus is more about narrowing geographic gaps. The focus is on places that are in more distress, and it's industry agnostic. It's about broadband, but in terms of what the model and theory of change is, broadband as basic infrastructure designed to allow a wide range of jobs and sectors to flourish when broadband comes to town. Then there's the EDA's Tech Hub programs, $500 million to create and seed new tech or innovation hubs across the country. It's a competitive process designed to focus on places that are higher capacity and designed to help boost regional competitiveness and national competitiveness in a range of tech fields. Further down the road toward the industry-specific competitiveness programs, of course, is the CHIPS program. $50 billion to support domestic semiconductor manufacturing and related activities. Clearly, this is about finding the places and companies with the greatest capacity to do this work, not necessarily focusing on places in most distress, and it is industry specific. Now, it is not explicitly a place-based program in the sense that the CHIPS program is not about identifying places for investment, but because of the magnitude of the investment in the CHIPS program, in practice, CHIPS money will end up being transformative in whatever local economy that this money goes. So in practice, I would put CHIPS also in the category of place-based policies. Everything I just described is what's happening at the Commerce Department. And if you know the federal government, you know that lots of things go on at the Commerce Department, including things that you were never really sure which department something was in, then it's probably in the Commerce Department. Beyond commerce, there are also place-based policies going on at the National Science Foundation, like their regional innovation engines, Department of Energy's regional clean hydrogen hubs, lots of programs at transportation, ag, and so on. So why now? Why this focus on place-based policies? I started describing some of the broader trends around geographic inequality, but these trends, rising geographic inequality, declining geographic mobility, these trends have been going on for decades. So why is the moment now? So I think I have three answers to this. The first is that I think there was, at a point, a sense that perhaps geographic inequality might start to solve itself. Technology makes it easier for people to move. Certainly during the pandemic, there was some expectation across the country that remote work would, in effect, serve as an economic development strategy, that places that might not have had a concentration of jobs in high-paying sectors could nonetheless attract people to work remotely to live in those places and build up those sectors. It turns out that the pandemic and remote work, despite all of the changes that have come as a result of pandemic and remote work, changed the geographic pattern of economic activity fairly little. The migration patterns during the pandemic, for the most part, looked just like migration patterns before the pandemic. There were some places, to be sure, that lost more people in business during the pandemic than before, mostly downtowns in big, rich cities where lots of people could work from home and therefore weren't spending money on service businesses during the day downtown. And also places particularly dependent on business travel and international tourism, Orlando, Vegas, Hawaii. Aside from those examples, though, pandemic migration patterns looked largely like pre-pandemic patterns. People who moved to work remotely, they were moving to Boise more than they were moving to Buffalo, just as before the pandemic. Most people also moved within metros, not across the country, not between labor markets. And so, there still remains this sense that even with remote work, place still matters very, very much, and people need and deserve economic opportunities where they live. So that's the first and most important motivation behind a lot of this place-based investment in the administration. I think the second gets somewhat less attention, but increasingly important. And this relates to the whole discussion of supply chains and resilience, that when thinking about where economic activity happens within the US, it's important to think about resilience with respect to natural and other disasters. Surely we are now very focused on what it means for resilience to be very dependent on semiconductor production, highly concentrated in Taiwan. But we could say the same for many domestic sectors as well, that there are probably some activities that, all else equal, it is probably resilience building not to have an entire sector concentrated in, say, an area prone to earthquakes or floods or dependent on a particular power company's shaky grid. So I think this sense of resilience and geographic diversification, while we usually talk about it in the international or trade context, also applies domestically as we think about some of these place-based policies. I think a third reason, also important, is that so much of US politics is geographic based. Our congressional districts are geographic based, and increasingly partisanship is correlated with education level. And so geographic inequality might be contributing to political polarization. At the same time, places that are distressed cross the political spectrum. There are blue places that are struggling and red places that are struggling. It is a kind of inequality that could find bipartisan support to help address. So I think there is a particular political imperative to think about geographic inequality probably in a more heightened way than in the past. So underlying all of these reasons has also been what I think of as an intellectual shift within economics about place-based policies. Now, the traditional view among economists, the economists that I sort of learned everything I know in grad school from, was you help people, not places. You help people by helping them move. The sort of caricature is the best economic development policy is a bus ticket to a place with more opportunity. And I think that remained the sort of ruling view of a lot of mainstream economics. Now, of course, lots of other disciplines were far more sophisticated in their understanding of place-based policies and economic development. And economists had, probably a bit of catching up to do on that. But that was the traditional view. I think the other traditional view in mainstream economics is the value of agglomeration and how much more productive industries are when they agglomerate together, fostering innovation, random exchange of ideas, making it easier for workers to find jobs and have alternatives if one company fails. So there were always been these very strong sense of agglomerations having value, both in terms of fueling innovation and productivity. In fact, there was, the paper several years ago from Moretti and Seh that argued that if we only allowed or encouraged New York and the Bay Area to grow much more, that could add meaningfully to GDP. In other words, we needed more geographic concentration for our macroeconomic health, not less. So what changed in terms of this intellectual view in the economics world? I think one change was the rise of the opioid crisis, of deaths of despair, and seeing how geographically concentrated not just economic distress, but social distress was as well, and a sense that it's essentially an externality, that it is harder to thrive in places that aren't thriving. And so I think that sort of highlighted the danger of geographic inequality and concentrated challenges. I think another sort of realization or evolution intellectually in the economics world was an acknowledgement of the limits to agglomeration. And in part, this has to do with housing supply and congestion. In theory, one can say that it would boost GDP if we just let New York or encourage New York and the Bay Area to grow bigger and bigger. But in a world where in practice, housing supply is near inelastic in the places that score highest on traditional productivity measures, like the way you then get growth in innovation is not to just add to the existing agglomerations that we already have, but rather think more broadly and encourage additional tech hubs, additional centers around the US as essentially, the way economists refer to a second best solution. So that's where the intellectual movement has sort of underpinned this move toward more place-based policies. Now, this stuff is hard. Like, investing in places is hard. It is hard whether you are the government, whether you are the private sector, or nonprofits. There are a lot of good reasons why this is hard to do. At the very top of the list of why this is hard is it's hard to pick the right places. You have to be really clear of what the goals of your program are. Are the right places for a program, the optimal places, those in greatest distress or those with the most capacity? It's hard to measure distress. Different measures of distress tell different stories. The places with the highest unemployment in the US right now are not the same as the places with the slowest growth. So depending on what we mean by distress, you could end up having very different places in mind in terms of who you should target. It's even harder to measure capacity. What does it mean for a place to have the capacity to become the next tech hub? Workforce, infrastructure, again, a certain set of civic institutions and arrangements, all very hard to quantify. We sort of saw one version of this play out very publicly with the Amazon HQ2 competition, I guess, a few years ago. And that was, for many people, like the first time that like site selection sort of broke into the mainstream discourse. But it raised lots of important issues about why companies or government or others might choose some places or others. And what do we actually mean when we talk about a place having capacity to turn investments into positive economic outcomes? So one reason this is hard is it's hard to pick the right places. It is also hard because you need to ensure that program goals are achieved. And place-based policies have a history of things, sometimes going a little off track. And I think one common example is often place-based investments end up being capitalized into real estate values. And despite the intentions of the program, it can be the case that when you invest in a place, it ends up benefiting meaningfully, basically the landowners who were there already. And so one actually has to, be very careful and think about the details of program design, that if the goal is to create a certain kind of jobs, that the program is actually designed to create jobs and not just to invest in a place and hope that those investments somehow end up translating into good jobs for current residents, as opposed to all of the other ways in which those investments could get capitalized into something else. I think a third reason why investing in places can be hard is we want to avoid zero-sum games. Like, the goal is not to simply have localities competing with each other with tax breaks to lure companies, say, from California to Texas and then back again. This is not productive. It is not where most job creation comes from. We know most job creation comes from either new establishments being born or existing ones expanding, not from establishments moving from one place to another. So it's important to avoid those sorts of zero-sum games. And we don't just want to subsidize activity that would have happened anyway. The point of these investments, whether it's place-based or not, is actually creating incentives for economic activity that wouldn't have happened otherwise. That is hard to do. It can also be hard to measure. And a lot of the measurement of evaluation of these programs really hinges on trying to figure out, would that additional economic activity would have happened anyway without that program? So data and research are essential for getting all these things right. Today, we're announcing a new initiative to focus on these programs, a regional economic research initiative, to provide research, data products, data services to help inform these place-based policies. 3 parts to this initiative. First, bringing together and showcasing all the local and regional data that already exist within the federal statistical system and beyond. There's incredibly rich data on the local industry mix and economic conditions and social and demographic characteristics, sometimes not as well known as more high-profile data sources, but incredibly rich tools that can help measure things like distress and capacity and so on. And it's an essential baseline of measuring the before picture when you are then going to set out to do any proper evaluation of the effects of these programs. Second, we're going to plan to track where federal investments are being made across multiple programs. It is very hard to do an evaluation of any one place-based program if you're not exactly sure of whether a place got money from other unrelated programs. And the government, parts of the federal government, don't always know exactly what every other part of the federal government's doing. And so tracking the range of these programs and sort of getting it all basically in the same spreadsheet is essential for doing this sort of evaluation work. And then connecting the local economic data, again, that already exists, with data on federal investments can help us improve program design, implementation, and evaluation. Our hope is that this will give us a holistic view of all the place-based policies that are underway, how they're combating geographic inequality and boosting regional competitiveness in aggregate. It's also a way of helping the federal government understand the local perspective. Local leaders see all of these different programs that the federal government has going on, sometimes more clearly than anyone in a given bureau of the federal government, him or herself, sees. In a sense, by trying to bring together data across all these programs, it's helping the federal government get more aligned with the local perspective and how local leaders experience learning about these programs, applying for these programs, and trying to understand how the programs all fit together. So we plan to release some initial data-driven insights in a few months. So I encourage everyone to please watch for that. So I'm hopeful that our initiative and investments will meaningfully reduce geographic inequality and boost regional competitiveness. Again, people deserve to have economic opportunity where they live. Place-based policies are important, though hard to get right, and data analysis are essential. I'm grateful for the resources and effort that local leaders, universities, and corporate partners put in to helping communities thrive. And looking forward to discussing this, continuing the discussion with you this afternoon and tomorrow. Thanks very much. Yeah, absolutely.
Folks, well, first of all, Jed, thank you very much. Really exciting news. Gosh, I wish I'd known you were going to share that news. This is fantastic. I think a lot of people are going to want to know how to engage with you in commerce in this new initiative. One question I would maybe give as moderator privilege, how can we help you all in the Department of Commerce? I'm going to answer that now. But is anyone in the audience, does anyone have a question for Jed? We have a minute or two, and I thought you might take advantage of having him here. Please.
Is there a name for this program?
So the research initiative is called the Regional Economic Research Initiative, and that is coming out of the Commerce Department. That is in addition to all the programs I mentioned. So all the programs I mentioned are about different bureaus giving away money for particular purposes. My office is in a bit of a different position. We don't give away money. The downside of that is people are sometimes less excited to see me coming than they are some of my colleagues who run bureaus that give away lots of money. But the flip side is that my bureau can have a bit more of a broad perspective across all the activities going on at Commerce and across the department, and are sort of half a step removed to be able to do this sort of objective research and even sort of external, internal advising and technical assistance to bureaus that are doing this work. Thanks.
One more question, please.
Just, you lived in San Francisco. I'm curious if you guys are watching like the situation there in like Silicon Valley on sort of like what's going on in terms of pricing and housing and everything is sort of an example of what you don't want to have happen. I'm just curious what your thoughts are and what you guys are thinking about that. I mean, the whole area.
Yeah, so I'm going to give so I don't even know if I can do this in my role. If I'm allowed to, this is strictly personal, not official in terms of my point of view. So I just said that out loud, everyone heard it. So having lived in San Francisco for 20 years, now living in DC, one of the biggest differences in terms of the experience of the pandemic in San Francisco versus elsewhere, of course, was the dependence on tech. And I think at the height of the pandemic, like San Francisco, New York, lots of other places where a similarly high share, still a minority, but a high minority of people were working from home, were sort of experiencing similar things in terms of relatively empty downtowns, really struggling service workers who had been dependent on business travel and so on. I think at this point, things have diverged a bit. And the places where the local economy is more dependent on tech is continuing to experience a different kind of challenges because fewer people are back in the office. Whereas places, and I'm thinking like a San Francisco versus New York comparison, where the local economy is more dependent on finance, where the expectations about in-office work are very different right now than in tech, appear to be seeing more activity returning to the center of the city with all of the related effects on local businesses, transit, and so on. So I think, we're going to continue to see the experience of cities and regions that might have been similarly hard hit during the pandemic possibly diverge based on which sector that could have been done from home during the pandemic, they are still concentrated in, given that sectors are now responding very differently to work from home. I'll be around, happy to answer further questions, more discussion throughout the rest of the event. Thanks very much.